going to talk about gobies. You might notice that I'm in a new location today, and the reason for that is I would like to show you Frank's tank. Now, if you have been following along for a while, you probably know that I have a funny cowfish named Frank, and some of you have been asking about how he's doing. Well, this is Frank's new tank, so enjoy Frank and his comedy routine behind me as we talk about gobies today. Now, as we're going to talk about gobies, I'm not going to talk about all of them, right? So today I'm just going to be focusing on the gobies that are the sand-sifting gobies, the gobies that are burrowers, and the ones that form the symbiotic relationships with shrimp. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to gobies, my favorite thing about them is that symbiotic relationship that they can form with those shrimp. If you've never seen it, it's incredible. I encourage you to go and search for some videos, but the way it works is the shrimp and the goby together are going to have a burrow. The shrimp is kind of going to act like a homemaker. It's going to stay in that burrow, make sure that the sand is pushed out, that there's enough space in there for the goby to swim around. It's going to keep things clean. Now the goby, to do its part, is going to guard the burrow, but it's also going to make sure that it and the shrimp are getting enough food. So it's a really cool relationship to watch, especially if you have a nano reef tank. It's absolutely fascinating. I've got a shrimp goby pair in my reef tank. I've tried so hard to get videos for you guys, but it's a little bit difficult, but it's so cool when you actually get to see it in action. All right, now, if you've seen these videos, you know I like to break things down. Today, it's a little bit more difficult, but we're gonna break things down into the small gobies and then all of the other gobies, right? Okay, before I get into that, I wanna know from you, if you've ever kept a goby, what goby have you kept? Was it a sand sifter or not? All right, let's jump into those small gobies. So when I say small, I mean about 2 to 3 inches in size. These guys are going to be better suited for some of your nano tanks. About 10-gallon tanks is going to be all that they need. First off is the clown goby. They're really cute. They like to perch and hang out on top of rocks. They almost remind me a little bit of lumpsucker fish, but you can get them in a couple different colors. A lot of times there's yellow, there's like an orangish yellow, and then you can find them in a green as well. Next up is going to be your high fin red banded goby. It's a mouthful, right? So as you might notice, there's a little shrimp icon on the whiteboard. Now with that, it means that that is going to be one of the gobies that will pair up with those shrimp and form the symbiotic relationships. So throughout the rest of this, if you see that little shrimp up there, that's what that means. Keep an eye out for it. Next is going to be the Yasha goby. And lastly will be our neon goby. So there's not too many of those gobies that fall into that small category. Let's jump on into, I guess, the medium size. First off, we have our orange spotted goby, the yellow watchman goby, our diamond watchman. Now, a lot of times if you are going through your local fish store, I do see more diamond watchmans than most other gobies that are out there. They're fairly common fish. Next, you are going to have your tiger watchman. You have your sleeper banded goby, the pink bar goby. Next up is the court jester goby. We have our pink spotted watchman goby. And lastly, the wheeler's goby. Now that's not all of the gobies. The very last goby is going to be the engineer goby. It is the largest of all of them that I talked about today. They can be up to 1 foot in size. That's a pretty massive fish in your tank. Make sure if you have an engineer goby that you're gonna have at least a 55-gallon tank for them. The rest of the gobies can be anywhere from a 10-gallon tank all the way up to a 30-gallon tank is about all that they're going to need. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that these guys are sand-sifting, burrowing fish. They like to hang out on the bottom. They're not going to be swimming up in the water column. They're not going to be like Frank. So you do need to make sure that you have a sand bed for these guys. And 2, if you want to keep corals, just be kind of careful because a lot of these sand sifters are going to pick up mouths full of sand and they're going to dump them. They don't care where they dump them, so sometimes that could be on your corals. You don't want corals accidentally dying because a goby dumped a mouthful of sand on it. And trust me, I've heard so many stories where that happened, so just do your research before you buy your goby. Maybe consider putting them in a fish-only tank. All right, that's all I've got to talk about for different tank sizes and different types of gobies, let's go head to the kitchen and talk about nutrition. Okay, let's talk about the different kinds of nutrition and foods that you can feed your gobies. Right now, gobies are considered omnivores, but for the most part, a lot of them are carnivores, which means when you are getting foods, you need to look for those rich, meaty foods that have a lot of protein and a good bit of fat for them. Now, I'm curious if you've got a goby in your tank, let me know what its favorite type of food is. So, typically in these videos, I like to break things down into 3 different groups, and one of those is the gel DIY foods. And I'm still going to talk about that today, but we'll talk about it a little later on. So right now, we're going to start with our dry and pellet foods. So one thing that makes pellets really great for gobies is a lot of times they'll sink down through the water column, hang it, and land down in the sandy bottom where those gobies will hang out. So foods like this coral frenzy are going to be great for feeding not only your gobies but any corals that they happen to fall in or around. So this is one option. You can also use a food like Nyos. It actually has Goji in it, which is going to help bring out some of those colors, especially any red pigments. So if you've got some of those pink gobies, definitely consider giving them some of this food. Next up is the PE Mysis pellets. I'm a big fan of the PE Mysis line, whether it be the frozen or the pellets, but one great thing about these pellets is that they are quick sinking, they're a little bit denser, so they're gonna fall to the bottom and get right to where your gobies are hanging out. Now the last dry food I've got to talk about today is the TDO Reef Nutrition. This is another one that has a lot of nutrients in it and is good for those small-mouthed gobies. Okay, next up, and this is a little bit different. We've talked about live foods in the past, but today, especially with gobies, we're going to mention live foods. Now this is one that you can get on the Marine Depot website, but you have a lot of different options when it comes to live foods. For example, if you are going to your local fish store, a lot of times you can pick up a variety of the Reef Nutrition pods, or you can even order them direct online. Now, if you guys have seen my Instagram, you saw when I got the package of them last week. I'm impressed how many of you guys recognize that Reef Nutrition box. I didn't even have anything about it, and you guys knew exactly where it came from. So they are a great company to work with, and like I said, we'll send them directly to your door. Next, when it comes to the live foods, you can always go through your filter socks and pick out the pods that are already in there. Now, if you pick them out, you can get one of those little pod habitats and kind of dump them back into where your pod habitat is. That's going to help to seed your population of pods and just help them to grow exponentially, and it's going to be a food source that's always in your tank for those gobies. Now, our last type of food that I'm going to talk about today is the frozen food. Do you feed frozen foods in your tank? Let me know below. Okay, so a whole bunch of different options. We're going to go through them kind of quick. So we have the Reef multi-pack. Again, that's great if you've got a variety of different fish in your tank that you're feeding. And I know it's really hard for you guys to see, but some of these, once they start to melt and break down a little bit in the water column, they're going to float around, and it's going to provide a good, fun method of enrichment for those fish to swim after and get that food. Now, krill is another good one that you can feed your gobies, as well as brine shrimp. Now, I know that you might not see these that often in your local fish store, but you can definitely buy these brands online, and a lot of times it's one that big wholesalers, that fish wholesalers will use to feed their fish. Now, lastly is going to be the Prime Reef by Reef Nutrition. As you can see, it's really easy just to pop out one of those individual cubes. So if you have a nano tank, consider getting one of the ones with blister packs. All right, that wraps up everything I've got to talk about when it comes to nutrition. Let's head up and talk about some of the issues that your gobies might face. When it comes to your gobies or any other fish, you really do want them to live a good, long, healthy life. Now, let me give you some tips that I've experienced, issues that gobies have run into in the past, things that are fairly common. Now, the first one is probably the biggest one. All of these gobies, for the most part, that I've talked about today, with the exception of some of those smaller ones, They're sand sifters. They like to burrow in the sand, they like to sift through the sand, which means your sand bed is a really important aspect of your tank. You don't want a goby to be the first fish that you add, especially not to a brand new tank. You want to give your sand and your substrate some time to mature and to grow. So I would recommend adding your goby after your substrate is, I would say, 4 to 6 months old, just to make sure that there's going to be enough nutrients in there for them when they're going and sifting through that sand. While you'll be feeding them other foods, the ones that are sand sifters, that's a part of their diet. It's a part of their lifestyle, so you want to make sure that you are setting them up for success. Now, something that I've seen more commonly with gobies than with other fish is internal parasites and worms. Right. Now, I'm going to give you a story to kind of show you why this is important. If you are paying attention to your fish every day, if you're spending time with them, if you're watching and observing them, you're going to know right off when something is wrong. Now, several years ago, I had a diamond goby. It was one of the healthiest eaters in the tank, and after a while, I would start to notice that it would come up for food and would just eat and eat and eat. And its belly would be full, and it would go down and it would sift through the sand, and I would come back about 30 minutes later and notice that its stomach was sunken in. Now, when you see that sunken in stomach, that's a good sign or an indicator that something might be wrong with your fish. Now, the reason I tell you to watch and observe is because if you start to see those things happening, say you feed, and then an hour later your fish's stomach is starting to be sunken in, they should be holding on to food for a little bit longer. So when you see that, that's going to give you an indicator that you maybe should try medicating. When I mentioned earlier in the kitchen that I was going to talk about gel or DIY foods, this is where they come in. So you can mix in medications with those gel and DIY foods, and when you're feeding the fish, when they're gobbling up that food because they always seem hungry, that medication will already be in there. It'll get into their system and it'll hopefully help them to kick those parasites. Another product that's out there that's already got the medication mixed in is Dr. G's. You just have to go and look for this. There's a bunch of different places where it's available. You might have to order it online, but that is an option and it does work. Next up, when it comes to gobies, some of them can be have sensitive skin. If you notice your goby kind of looking slimy or maybe like it's surrounded in a snot ball, that's a good indicator that it's really stressed out and something is wrong with its slime coat. So you can do something like adding Dr. Tim's First Defense, or API has a product called Stress Coat. Both of those will do a good job at helping to boost their immune system and help to protect their slime coat. Now, always make sure that you're doing your water changes when you get new fish. You're going to want to make sure that you're dipping them or quarantining them, all super important things. Now, let's talk about enrichment. So, gobies, they're sand sifters. They like to sift through the sand. If you have a fowler tank, it would be a great idea to move around your rocks, kind of redecorate. Think of when you're in your own house and you move the furniture around, you kind of come in, you're like, wow, it looks new and exciting, and it's very refreshing. So the same thing goes for changing up your fish's environment, especially allowing them to get to some sand that they might not have been able to get to before. So that's one big way to add enrichment to their lives. Now, in the past, I've talked about adding enrichment in the sense of changing up the lighting patterns. Now, gobies, you don't want to do this with. I can't stress that enough. Gobies are jumpy fish. They are going to need to be in tanks that have lids on them. So many times I've heard people tell me stories of even with lids, gobies somehow were able to get out. You don't want that to happen to your goby, and you want to make sure you're eliminating any stressors that would cause them to jump. So that's why you don't want to use changing up that lighting schedule or programming a thunderstorm or something as a way for enrichment for them. Another thing that you can do for your gobies to switch things up for them is those live foods, right? We talked about copepods earlier, so you can switch the type of copepods that you are giving your gobies. That'll be something new and different and fun for them to enjoy, just like you're getting, a new fun breakfast cereal that's, not the same old thing that you've been having. Another way that you can enrich their lives is through tank mates, right? So gobies are great for community tanks. They get along with a lot of other fish that you might have in your reef tank or in your fowler tank. One group that they don't get along well though with is other gobies, right? They tend to be very aggressive towards the same species or towards other species of gobies, with the exception of if they have a mated pair of gobies. Typically those obviously are going to get along a little bit better, but use some caution before putting two gobies in a tank together that are not those mated pairs. Now, if you're not sure if your fish will go good together, always check out that fish compatibility chart. You can find it on marinedepot.com. Look and see if the fish you want to put in the tank together are going to get along well. All right, guys, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time. Let me know in the comments below what video you are most looking forward to next.